Everybody, I think we're going to get underway here. Thanks so much for taking your seats. Good morning, folks. I'm really thrilled to welcome you to UCLA Law today. I'm Cara Horowitz. I'm the Executive Director of our Emmett Insitute on Climate Change and the Environment. As many of you know, the Emmett Insitute is the home for all things environment at UCLA Law and was the first law school program in the country founded to really focus on climate change issues. I'm going to start today's program with a land acknowledgement. As part of UCLA, a land grant institution, we acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples. Today's topic really couldn't be more timely, and I'm thrilled to see so many of you in the room today to share it with us. As the world heats up, and we increasingly transition to cleaner forms of energy and technologies, we're realizing how dependent we are on critical minerals to help accomplish this transition. President Biden talked a lot about this transition last night in the State of the Union, for those of you who are able to tune in. He mentioned in particular new advanced battery manufacturing facilities opening in the United States. The truth is that the production of electric vehicles, batteries, energy infrastructure to aid in this transition to cleaner technologies requires a steady stream of minerals such as lithium, cobalt, and copper. And today these minerals are both in short supply and they're largely in the control of a few key global producers. These dynamics have gotten the attention of policymakers both in the United States and abroad. Just earlier this week, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen was in Chile talking about these issues and the likely rise in demand for lithium from Chile to the United States. U.S. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm recently discussed the dangers of our over-reliance on countries who don't share our values in this space. That was a clear reference to China, which currently accounts for about 60% of the world's production of rare earth minerals and materials. So against all of this background, we have speakers gathered here at UCLA today from really all around the world to talk about these issues, including issues surrounding supply chain governance questions, really interesting questions about geopolitical wranglings that are happening around these topics, and importantly, effects on vulnerable communities from the rise in mining for these critical minerals and ways to reduce those harms. So with proposals for some of these projects slated for the Salton Sea region, which is not that far from here, and other areas of the Southwest, concerns about these impacts to communities are hitting really close to home and are affecting communities in California. So I could not be more happy to host this conversation here at a great public university in Los Angeles. We'll talk about all this today. I'm really looking forward to it. Before we jump in, I want to thank our co-sponsors. They include the Promise Institute for Human Rights, the Native Nations Law and Policy Center here at the Law School, the International and Comparative Law Program, and our student-run Journal of Environmental Law and Policy. JELP students, raise your hands. Thank you. Thank you so much for all you've done to help bring this together. I also want to thank some key members of our team who have spent countless hours on the program. Sabrina Ashtian, Evan George, Juan Pablo Escudero, and very importantly, Heather Morphew, with whom many of you have probably emailed, our wonderful program manager at the Emmett Institute. And without further delay, I'm happy to kick us off. I'm going to introduce our morning keynote speaker. Secretary Christina Snider-Ashtari serves as Tribal Affairs Secretary to Governor Gavin Newsom. She leads the Governor's Office of Tribal Affairs. As a member of the Cabinet, Secretary Snider-Ashtari advises the Governor on tribal issues and oversees effective government-to-government consultations between the Newsom administration and California tribes. She also informs, develops, and implements policy directives related to tribal governments and Native American communities in California. She leads the California Truth and Healing Council and the California Indian Heritage Center Task Force, and she oversees the Tribal Nations Grant Fund program. The Secretary is an enrolled member of the Dry Creek Rancheria Band of Pomo Indians. I'm really pleased to say she's also she has a bit of a homecoming coming back to this room and to UCLA Law. She received her law degree from UCLA Law in 2013. She and I were joking about how familiar this room looks to her, how many memories it brings back. I'm sure all of them good. She can maybe share some of those memories with us if she's inspired. She's also a double Bruin. She got her history degree as an undergrad from UCLA. I'm really looking forward to hearing her thoughts about this issue because these issues, as I've mentioned, are really relevant and important to many of the communities that I know she represents very ably and well in her position. So thank you, Secretary, for joining us. I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
You can hear me? Great. Thank you, Professor, for those kind words. All of my memories are not exactly positive, but they're interesting, so I'm happy to be back here at UCLA Law. And I congratulate all of you for getting up this early on a Friday. I know that's kind of a task in law school. So hello, everyone, and thank you to the Emmett Insitute and UCLA Law for inviting me back to join you all here today and to share a little bit about the tribal affairs and energy work we're engaged in here in California. It's an honor to join you here in the ancestral homelands of the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples. And I want to acknowledge there's a couple tribal leaders in the room, so if you want to just stand up and say hi. Chairman Tortes, maybe. And anyone else who's in the room who'd like to be acknowledged, please stand up at this time too. Okay. Well, again, my name is, well, first I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit more about myself and what I do in order to frame what I'm going to talk with you about today. Some of you are probably familiar with Indian law and with tribal relations and history here in California, but many of you may not be, and so this might be the first time you're getting kind of a little bit of a snapshot of what we do here in California, what the history is, and why it's so critical to be thinking about this in the context of energy transition. So again, my name is Christina Snider-Ashtari, and I'm at Mihilakana and Macamo, and a member of the Dry Creek Rancheria Band of Pomo Indians, which is a small tribe located in Sonoma County, California. And I currently serve as the Tribal Affairs Secretary for Governor Gavin Newsom. In the years leading up to serving in this role, and after graduating from here, I served as Executive Secretary of the Native American Heritage Commission here in California, which is a commission that's responsible for protecting cultural resources and sacred sites and ensuring that tribes have a seat at the table in the protection of those things. I was also an attorney for several tribes nationwide, assisting them with on-reservation community and economic development, and then also served as a staff attorney with the National Congress of American Indians in DC, where a large part of my portfolio was advocating for tax parity, updates to right-of-way on Indian land, regulations, and community and economic development opportunities. In doing this work, I've always brought my whole self to whatever we're working on and constantly rely on my values and the long game for California Indian country as we collectively navigate the challenges of engaging in a society that doesn't always account for our unique histories, perspectives, and community care. As Tribal Affairs Secretary for the Governor, on paper my role is to advise the Governor, the Governor's Office, and the administration, and to serve as a direct link between tribes in California and the Governor, facilitate communication and consultation between tribes and state agencies, and review state legislation and regulations affecting tribes or Native communities and provide recommendations. In practice, this means a lot of listening, educating, empathizing, and informing. I listen to hear and understand where people are at so I can meet them where they are. I educate people on where they may have blind spots without judging those blind spots, because if you grew up in California, you know our education system doesn't always tell us all we need to know about what happened before gold was discovered. I empathize with their worldview because there's really no one who has a universal understanding of the issues facing every community. And I inform them of how they might approach their work differently to account for the perspective of a California Native person or community. So again, that said, I don't speak for everybody. I have a unique worldview and a unique perspective, but I hope to kind of capture different worldviews in the work that I do. In addition, it means a lot of repeat history lessons and introductions to tribal government conversations, both of which I will briefly go into now. So if you weren't a history major, now you need to learn a little bit of history. For those of you that haven't done Indian law, it's so intertwined with the history of the United States and pre-contact and successive waves of European colonization that you can't actually learn it without actually having a better understanding of how it came to be. So prior to European contact, California was one of the most, or it was actually the most diverse and populous land base north of what is now Mexico, with over 300 distinct language groups and cultures. California Native peoples have survived through successive waves of relocation, federally and state-funded militia removal and genocide, and land dispossession. Moving is needed for survival and for work. During wartime, several communities moved to urban areas to serve or work to support wartime efforts. Large non-California Native populations have made California their home as well. So for example, the two largest groups in California are Navajo and Cherokee, but they are not from California, but are now, do now make their home here. And they were relocated by federal government policies and practices as well. So a lot of shuffling, not a lot of choice. As a result, California is now home to the largest Native American population in the entire United States. There are currently 109 federally recognized tribes and about 63 non-federally recognized tribes indigenous to the state. Recognition is the United States recognition of tribes as governments with rights and obligations that appertain to those governments. There's a unique legal and political relationship between the federal government and federally recognized tribes, which is based in the US Constitution, treaties, Supreme Court decisions, federal laws, and executive orders. So now if you get a surprise question on the bar exam, you'll know a little bit, because we actually had that my year with me and my husband, and we like high-fived after, but everybody else was really upset because they didn't know. As sovereign nations, tribal governments have the inherent right to hold elections, determine their own citizenship, and consult directly with the United States on policy, regulations, legislation, and funding. That's why with state engagement, a lot of times with progressive and helpful federal administrations, state engagement becomes less of a priority for tribes because they can get directly what they need from the federal government. But because of the unique history in California, we try to be good partners regardless, because there's been some delegation of authorities over the past several decades. Non-federally recognized tribes do not enjoy the same recognized rights and responsibilities under United States law, but do have legal rights under California law to protect cultural resources and sacred sites and to repatriate ancestors. So a lot of what you see in the news about CalNAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and institutions like UCLA, bringing home ancestors to tribes, a lot of that is part of what that means. Throughout the history of the development of this state, and in most other parts of the country, Native people have been relocated from resource-rich homelands to less desirable areas. Where development progressed, cultural resources and ancestors were destroyed, extractive industries polluted waterways and land, and infrastructure and energy development either completely intentionally bypassed Indian lands, effectively islanding them, or rights-of-ways offering unconscionable terms were forced through Indian lands with little benefit to or consultation with the tribes surviving on those lands. Today, California Native people still suffer from major land loss, lack of basic infrastructure, decimation of waterways, and obstruction of lifeways. So during Governor Newsom's time in office, we've had several discussions on how he might make a difference for Native peoples, and he's demonstrated a willingness and a commitment to do better for California Native communities. He's embraced an approach that's grounded in the history of this state and its treatment of California Native Americans since its inception. The lens through which our administration views all of our work is that all Californians are best served when our systems, laws, and policies reflect the diversity and richness of all cultures in California. And we have to approach our work through a lens that fully and honestly accounts for everything that these populations have experienced. In working from this viewpoint, the state's in a better position to address current and ongoing systemic problems and engaging and integrating California Native Americans and their valuable contributions by taking a critical and honest look at the historical root for these issues and the state's role in that history. Our state is now in a position to work to address these long-term injustices, make space for Native people, and reorient how we think about our collective future. And I think this is particularly important in the context of equitable infrastructure and energy development, given the history of exclusion, extraction, and extortion here in California. In June of 2019, the governor issued an executive order apologizing on behalf of the state of California to California Native Americans for the state's role in the genocide of those people, of our people. In addition to apologizing, the executive order established the California Truth and Healing Council, which is a California Native American-led effort charged with shifting the narrative of the historical relationship between the state of California and California Native Americans in order to create a more inclusive historical record that elevates and respects the California Native experience. In doing this work, the state of California has created a mechanism to center Native experiences and histories in mainstream narratives. Of particular relevance, it's possible that the Council could examine the systemic and intentional dispossession and destruction of Native ancestral lands and resources, the neglect of Native infrastructure and community development as part of its work, and it's been authorized to examine and make remedial recommendations that could seek to account for these gaps. In 2020, to build on the work of the Council and assist with tribes' ability to regain control of, access to, and ownership of their ancestral lands, the governor issued a statement of an administrative policy on Native American ancestral lands to encourage state entities to seek opportunities to support California tribes' co-management of and access to lands within their ancestral territory, and also to work cooperatively with tribes that are interested in acquiring lands in excess of state needs. In addition to the work we do with California tribes, the states included Indigenous and tribal engagement in several international memoranda of cooperation regarding climate action in order to support collaboration and furtherance of mutual priorities across the globe, including with Australia, Sweden, Canada, and New Zealand. Several of these countries have particularly underserved Indigenous populations or are in the spaces that you're talking about today, and we're particularly focused on looking at what's working in those places and also looking at what we can do to help bolster their approach with their Indigenous populations. The governor created my office in 2022 to basically work across agencies, elevating the role of tribal relations and the portfolio of work in California. And we do a lot. We do the consultation that was mentioned earlier. We also implement the governor's policy priorities related to tribal nations, Native communities, and Indigenous peoples. And we continue to work with tribal nations to improve government-to-government relations, advance justice and equity for California Native people, explore remedial action to address past atrocities, expand tribal stewardship of ancestral lands and natural and cultural resources, promote visibility of the rich diversity and history of California Native cultures, and partner with tribal governments to bolster sound and sustainable economic development in California Indian country. So that's a lot, but it's what we continue to do in addition to overseeing several of the bodies that were mentioned earlier. We saw over the course of the governor's last term, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, where inequities in energy and broadband deployment have severely challenged the ability for some tribes to engage in cooperative discussions or consultations with the state, in addition to creating gaps for telehealth, engaging with loved ones, or getting critical resources and information to communities. Most critically, over the last term, tribes and California Native people have increasingly spoken up and shown up as the state and federal government have asked what people need to be whole as more Native people enter decision-making roles and more decision makers are listening. California has recognized the critical need to view circumstances through an equity lens, that not all communities are in the same position, whether because of infrastructure gaps, historical inequities, and dispossession, or cultural differences, and the policy initiatives that we continue to support seek to be responsive to those differences. So that now brings me to the topic that you're going to be thinking about more today, critical minerals in the energy transition. Particularly, how do we do this right in the context of historical and often violent extractive practices with Indigenous people and resources across the globe? The Indian Energy Minerals Forum reported that 97% of nickel, 89% of copper, 79% of lithium, and 89% of cobalt are potentially on or within 35 miles of tribal lands. So those are lands taken into the trust by the federal government for the benefit of tribes. But remember, all of the United States is the ancestral territory of Indigenous people, regardless of how history's played out. Many of you may remember that the state's origin myth is based on the story of a discovery of gold, the shiny rock that would pave the way for the American dream for many. The harder reality of that myth is that its discovery paved the way for the genocide I spoke of earlier. Native people were enslaved, relocated, and murdered in the American pursuit of gold extraction. Over the course of California and United States history, the story and the awful consequences to Native people has not deviated much. Again, I can't speak for Native people across the country, but in California, extractive industries that negatively impact the lands, waters, plants, and animals also negatively impact the practice of old belief systems and worldviews for California Native people. Our origins and worldviews are intrinsically tied to these lands. An example, the names I told you for my tribes are Mihilakana, people of the Westwater, and Makamo, people of the Salmon Hole, both identities that derive from the land and are in relation to real places in this state. And most of our origin stories up and down the state tell us that we come from the actual earth that we are from. So when there are impacts to those places, or access is cut off, or mountains are haphazardly desecrated, real pieces of who we are and where we come from and how we commune with our culture are destroyed. We've seen where one of the most rich places for Native people to trade, at Clear Lake, has been destroyed through an early open pit mercury mining. And the Pomo people who continue to live there today continue to live largely in poverty and with the impacts of living on a Superfund site. We've seen resource extraction throughout the US, with only a small proportion of the benefits going to Native people. And where there have been benefits, those are often taken through insidious means, like if any of you have seen Killers of the Flower Moon, you'll kind of get what I'm talking about. Or read it, because it's a book. I read the book. I don't think I can watch it. It's too much. But if we want a better future that benefits us all, we need to be learning from these hard periods of human history and do better now that we know better. Assuming we are transitioning our energy systems because we want to preserve or sustain an environment rich in biodiversity and supportive of the full extent of the global human experience, we should make sure that we're transitioning in a way that is equitable and consciously seeks to overcome inherent and learned biases and value systems that prioritize certain worldviews over others and certain people over others. We also need to understand that the world as currently constituted is not set up for equity and tends to reward exclusionary value systems, increasing gaps in wealth or creating tables at which certain governments and interests have larger or sometimes the only voice. So what can we do about this? Well, in an ideal world, we would slow down a lot to ensure that we're doing this right and shifting the paradigm for resource extraction and energy development throughout the globe. We'd really take the time to engage with tribal communities and indigenous peoples and other underrepresented populations in nations with higher concentrations of critical minerals to ensure that we're elevating their people and voices in a good faith effort to meaningfully consider and adopt practices that will uphold their people, cultures, and belief systems. However, I acknowledge that we don't live in an ideal world and that we can't afford to lose time in the energy transition. The world we've created requires us to move quickly or else be left behind. Our policymakers have to take advantage of current conditions to disrupt norms and create a viable path away from fossil fuels. It's not an easy task, and if it takes too long, or is too costly, or too difficult, we may not get another shot to create a different future. So, given that this may be our one big push to shift global systems, it's important that we embed space for diverse worldviews into the way that we move forward, and that communities that may be asked to bear more of the burden on their ancestral lands and waters for the benefit of others are given voice, agency, and meaningful compensation in exchange. If we're really engaging in transitioning our energy systems to ensure quality of life for future generations, then we owe it to all future generations to do so in a way that upholds the rich diversity of human experience and worldviews. So I'll wrap today with a reminder that as you continue in your discussions and as you inevitably go out into the world to do this work, I urge you all to think about the ways that we can do better to bring everyone along and how we can build a future that seeks to be more inclusive of all people, worldviews, and value systems. Thanks.